Dear students, welcome to lecture 5 of week 3, wherein we have been discussing about the legal and regulatory framework. Today, we are going to discuss about policy framework for EOU, that is export oriented units, EPZ, that is export processing zones, and FTZ, that is free trade zones. Let us begin the journey. At the outset, let us evaluate the contents of today's lecture. First of all, we are going to have some introductory remarks as well as talk about the evolution of these different regimes. After that, we will talk about objectives and significance of EOUs, EPZ, and FTZs, followed by institutional and policy framework. Consequently, we will talk about export-oriented units, export processing zones, and free trade zones. After that, we will have some comparative analysis followed by incentives and compliance. Subsequently, we will talk about establishment and operations followed by challenges and structural issues. The penultimate discussion will be with respect to some case examples, and then we will conclude our discussion. At the very outset, it is imperative to understand that export-oriented policies are designed to enhance competitiveness, boost foreign trade, and attract investment. Export-oriented units, export processing zones, and free trade zones represent three complementary approaches to achieving these goals, that is, to achieve competitiveness, boost foreign trade, and attract investment. These units and zones offer specialized incentives, infrastructural requirement, regulatory flexibility, and trade facilitation mechanisms. Together, these schemes and zones integrate Indian enterprises into global supply chains and promote industrial growth. Let us focus on the evolution of these different schemes and zones. In 1965, the first export processing zone was established in Kandala, which was termed as Asia's earliest export processing zone. In 1990, in 1981, there was a launch of 100% export-oriented unit scheme, which extended benefits beyond designated zones. Between 1990s, between 1990s and 2000s, there was expansion of free trade zones and transition of export processing zones into special economic zones. The current focus of Indian government and trade regime is integration of export-oriented units, export processing zones, and free trade zone models within broader trade facilitation strategies. Let us focus on the policy objectives and strategic significance of these zones and schemes. These zones and schemes stimulate export led industrialization and value added manufacturing. They also encourage foreign direct investment, technology transfer, and innovation. These zones and units generate employment and develop regional economies. In addition, they create globally competitive ecosystems for trade and production. These zones and units strengthens India's balance of payments and foreign exchange reserves. Let us now try to understand the institutional and legal framework. This particular administration of the units has happened under the foreign trade policy. We have already discussed that foreign trade policy is an important policy of the government of India with respect to exports and imports. There were certain related legislations as well that have also assisted the creation of these units and zones, such as Customs Act of 1962 and Special Economic Zone of 2005. These particular units, that is EOU, EPZ, and FTZ, are oversight or monitored by certain organizations and institutions. These include the development commissionaries, where project approvals and monitoring happens. Board of approval, they are responsible for high level decision making related to these units and zones. The Directorate General of Foreign Trade and CBIC, which takes into consideration the regulatory and procedural facilitation. All these units, they operate in alignment with World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement. Let us now specifically try to understand the export-oriented units. Export-oriented units are industrial units. These industrial units are dedicated to producing goods or services exclusively for export. This exclusive production for export boosts India's exports and thus makes balance of trade positive. Export-oriented units can be established anywhere in India and they are not limited to any specific zones. Export-oriented units are allowed limited domestic tariff area sales subject to conditions. The key features of export-oriented units include long-term policy stability, that is, when these units are formed, whatever industries are working under these units, the policy which is determined for these units remains stable for a long period of time. The objective being that the unit should not be frustrated by changing their strategies or cost behavior from time to time due to changes in policies. Thus, they can become global players by having stability in the policy regime. The second is access to global markets. These units, which are present in the export oriented units, the industries can get benefit of accessing the global market because they are giving decision making assistance, management assistance, as well as other technical assistance. And by exploiting and making use of these assistance through policy, they can explore new markets and become global players. The third key feature is simplified customs procedures. For all the industries that are being set under export oriented unit, the custom clearance procedures are much easier and they are provided special facilities for custom clearance, thus giving them extra benefit over all other industries. And finally, the self certification and warehousing benefits. Warehousing as an important component in international trade. Certain types of specific goods require more need of warehousing, such as perishable commodities. Thus, if industries are set up under these export oriented units, they get additional benefit of warehousing benefits. Let us now try to see that if industries are set up under export-oriented units, what are the different incentives that they get and what are the compliance measures which they have to follow. The first benefit is that industries gets duty-free import of capital goods, inputs and consumables. They also receive exemption from indirect taxes and permission to retain 100% foreign exchange earnings. There is also flexibility to subcontract production domestically or abroad. It means that if they have a line of production from A to Z, in between, they can outsource the production to other industries and companies, both in India as well as in other foreign countries. This helps them to minimize the cost and also utilize a skilled workforce which is present in other regions of the country or in other parts of the world. Another important benefit is the issue of net foreign exchange. The compliance considers that net foreign exchange of these industries, which are being set up under export oriented units, should remain positive over a specified period of time. If not, then a specific time is given for the underperformer, but if they are not able to perform, then they may not be getting the benefit of export oriented units. Finally, compliance include annual reporting and periodic audit by the authorities who are responsible for export oriented units. The next is export processing zones, that is EPZs. Export processing zones are designated industrial zones created to promote export oriented manufacturing. They operate as foreign territories for trade and customs purposes. Export processing zones provide dedicated infrastructure, logistic supports, and simplified regulatory frameworks. Export processing zones also enable industrial clustering and technology diffusion, reducing transaction costs and time. Let us try to understand the export processing zones benefits and different performance parameters. The first one is pre-built infrastructure. Pre-built infrastructure and utilities are provided for quick project setup. Not only this, there is a facility and benefit of single window clearance and reduced regulatory interface. Under export processing zones, there is an issue and benefit of simplified trade procedures which can be used for preferential access to global markets. Performance monitored is also based on certain parameters such as export turnover, that is the total export sales of a particular company, net foreign exchange performance of a particular company, then employment creation and generation by the company, followed by the sectoral diversification. Let us now try to move to transition from export processing zones to special economic zones. There has been an experience that from export processing zones we can transform to special economic zones and there can be more benefits for the domestic industries. The experience earned from export processing zones informed the development of special economic zones, which was enacted as an act in 2005. Special economic zones expand beyond manufacturing to include services, research and development, logistics, and e-commerce. Special economic zones provide greater scale, legal backing, and incentive attractiveness. One of the most important limitation for industries is that they do not have costs to bear the legal backing. However, in international trade, several times legal complications do arise, creating rift and disputes. Thus, the one benefit, which is an important benefit of a special economic zone, is legal backing, which is provided under this scheme. Special economic zones now serve as the primary policy vehicle for export promotion zones. Let us now reach to discuss the free trade zones. Free trade zones are customs-free enclaves allowing duty-free import, storage, processing, and re-export. Custom duties are imposed under free trade zones only when goods enter the domestic market. The focus area of free trade zones is re-export trade, also known as entry-port trade, transshipment hubs, and global logistics and distribution. Free trade zones strengthens India's position in global supply chains and logistics network. Let us try to understand the free trade zone's operational features and economic role. Free trade zones are located near ports, airports, or logistics corridors for better connectivity. They permit value addition, repackaging, labeling, and light processing without customs duties. Also, free trade zones facilitate global inventory management and trade financing. Free trade zones also support industries such as electronics, petrochemicals, e-commerce, and warehousing. Dear students, let us try to have a comparative analysis of export-oriented units, export processing zones, and free trade zones. With respect to location, EOU can anywhere in the country, while export processing zones are certain designated industrial zones that are decided by the government, and free trade zones are at ports or logistics hubs. If we talk about from the parameter of customs status, they are, that is EOU, are within domestic territory. Export processing zones are treated as foreign territory, and free trade zone are outside customs territory. The third is focus. The focus of EOU is on export production, while the focus of EPZ is on export manufacturing clusters. In opposition to that, the focus of free trade zone is on trade, logistics, and re-export. With respect to DTA sale, that is domestic tariff area sales, it is limited applicable in the EOU. It is limited with certain conditions in EPZ, and it is not applicable in free trade zones. With respect to infrastructure, the infrastructure in EOU is self-provided, while the infrastructure in EPZ is state, that is provided by the country. In opposition to that, the infrastructure under free trade zone is provided by the port in which it operates. Finally, with respect to key advantage, the key benefit of EOU is flexibility and fiscal incentives. On the other hand, the key benefit of export processing zones is cluster benefits and infrastructure. And finally, the benefits that accrue from free trade zones is logistics efficiency and duty suspension. Dear students, let us now try to focus on establishment and approval procedures. The different approval procedures are in vogue which are required to be fulfilled. There is a requirement wherein submission of detailed project proposal and feasibility report is required. Also, evaluation by unit approval committee or board of approval is required, followed by execution of legal undertakings and customs bond. For these particular units, there is a requirement of compliance with environmental, sectoral, and labor regulations. The commencement of operation in these units is always followed by periodic reporting. Let us now talk about customs, fiscal, and non fiscal incentives. The fiscal incentives include duty free imports, goods and services tax exemptions, concessional finance, and EPCG, that is capital goods benefit. The third is customs. The second is customs, where there is simplified clearance, bonded warehousing, and deferred duty payment. And the third is non fiscal incentives, which include infrastructure support, single window approvals, export facilitation services, training, and testing support. Now it is time for us to focus on the performance obligation and monitoring for these units. For all these units, there is always a periodic evaluation of export performance, net foreign exchange requirement, and investment utilization. The development commissionaries and customs authorities conduct regular inspections and audit. If non compliance is found, it may lead to withdrawal of status, penalty and duty recovery, as well as cancellation of the incentives. Exit provisions from these units is also possible, which include debonding and conversion into domestic tariff area units. Let us now try to see that what are the key challenges and structural issues. One of the first key challenge is infrastructure and logistics bottlenecks in certain zones. We all know that certain zones are better and certain zones require improvement. Thus, there may be differences in the infrastructure and logistics arrangements. The second is overlapping policy provisions and lack of coordination among agencies. As different agencies are monitoring these units and zones, there may be sometimes overlapping of the rules, regulations, and inspection procedures. This may create problems for the units or zones. The third is global trade volatility and which affects export performance. Global trade is volatile because of geopolitical, economical, and different social factors. The fourth is intense competition from ASEAN, that is Association of Southeast Nations, China, and Gulf Free Trade Zones. In order to counter these competitions, EOUs, FTZs, and export processing zones needs to work harder and should have more simplicity and should have more incentives for the industries. And finally, there is a need for integration with global trade agreements and supply chains. Dear students, let us take a case study to understand EOU, its relevance, EPZ, its relevance, and free trade zones relevance. The first example comes under export oriented unit, and the example is of Infosys BPO, that is Business Processing Outsourcing, which is established in Bangalore. Under EOU, there is a setup of 100% EOU for IT enabled services in Bangalore. Due to this, they have been able to leverage duty free imports and forex retention to expand globally. And we all are aware that Infosys is one of the top leading companies which have become a global IT company emerging from India. The second case pertains to an export processing zone, Santa Cruz Electronics Export Processing Zone in Mumbai. It was established in 1973 as India's flagship EPZ. Because of its existence, it has become a major hub of gems and jewelry and has had exported this with 300 plus small units. Thus, the success of gems and jewelry exports in India can be linked to EPZs. The third is the example of free trade zone, and the example is Gift City in Gujarat. Gift City in Gujarat functions as a duty-free trade and finance zone, and because of the benefits and incentives which it has received, it has become successful in facilitating re-exports, logistics, and international financial services. Thus, we can see with this case example that all these units and zone strengthens India's global competitiveness in international trade. Finally, let us try to conclude what all we have discussed in today's session. We have understood EOU, that is export oriented units, EPZ, that is export processing zones, and free trade zones. And we have appreciated that they are key instruments of India's export promotion strategy. We have understood and appreciated that these units and zones support export growth, foreign investment, employment, and global value chain integration. Export oriented units offer operational flexibility and fiscal benefits to exporters. Not only this, export processing zones drive industrial growth through dedicated infrastructure and cluster development. Also, we have highlighted that free trade zones enhance logistics efficiency, trade facilitation, and re-export potential. We can conclude in nutshell that continued policy reforms, digitalization, and global alignment will strengthen their impact on India's trade objectives. Dear student, with this we complete today's lecture. Thank you very much for being here with me.